Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Samurai Goddess. The goddess next door takes on kung fu killers in this action-packed martial arts Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Samurai Goddess in paperback and e-readers today. I got a comment from one of my viewers who thought that because there are Black Panther trade paperbacks selling well on Amazon.com and that they're the height of Black Panther's popularity due to the movie, the comic book industry was doing well. However, that's not the case at all. When it comes down to the comic book industry, the overall health of the industry is in the worst state it's ever been in. And all one has to do is head over to comichron.com and take a look at the stats for all of the books that are ordered by comic shops to see how bad things really are. I took a look at the numbers for December of 2017, and those numbers literally were putting another nail in the coffin of the overall comic book industry. When it comes down to comic books these days, comic shops aren't ordering comics like they used to, because all the numbers you see on comichron.com, those are the numbers for ordered books, not sold comic books. And when your numbers are at 141,000 for the number one book on that list, that means in a country of over 300 million people, that means not that many people are buying comic books. And that's really scary when you think about it, because in that country of 300 million people, we're in the middle of a huge boom as it relates to superhero movies, and we can barely move 141,000 of a comic book. And lower tier characters like Black Panther can barely get 30,000 or even 20,000 orders for a comic book. So the comic book industry is in a dire place right now. And it's so dire that over 50 comic book stores were forced to close due to poor sales. And the reason why so many comic book stores are struggling to sell comic books these days is due to the missteps of editors at DC Comics and Marvel Comics. Because at DC Comics back in 2011, Dan Dido, Jim Lee, and Bob Harris decided they were going to end the DC universe and start this whole New 52 universe. And many comic fans were so angry and alienated that they stopped buying DC Comics altogether. And that led to the start of a decline at DC Comics. And then over at 2015 at Marvel, they decided to go on this whole SJW diversity kick. And they replaced all the popular characters with diversity type characters, and Marvel fans got alienated and started walking away from that company. And with both companies not producing content that readers want, both companies wound up starting to decline. And what happened was many comic shop owners got caught in the middle. And many of these comic shop owners who back in 2011 started to suffer as New 52 books started to pile up, then had to deal with an onslaught of Marvel titles that wound up starting to pile up. And these days it's even getting worse, because indies like Image, Dark Horse, and many others are pushing SJW titles, as they're called, and those books are rotting on the shelves. And that's what's leading to many comic shops being forced to close, because most comic shops, when they buy comic books, they buy them from Diamond, the only distributor of comic books, and most of those comics aren't returnable. So any comic that doesn't sell at a comic shop, what happens is that comic shop owner has to wind up eating the cost of that comic book. And when it comes down to the comics being published these days, they're of such poor quality that the comic shop owners cannot even sell them in their quarter bins, because the comic books feature some of the worst writing in the medium, in the history of the medium, some of the worst art in the history of the medium, and some of the worst editing in the history of the medium. So a lot of these shop owners, they're getting caught in the middle, as these companies are out here either pushing a new set of characters they don't want, like DC did with the New 52, and the other things like Convergence and Rebirth, where they're trying to get things back on track, but it's just not where it needs to be. Or Marvel, which is just so caught up in identity politics and social justice that they're pushing books that the customer doesn't want, or trying to appeal to audiences that are so minuscule that it's not going to lead to anyone coming back to buy comics. Now, that also factors in when you think about the distribution of comic books. You have all these guys that are trying to push comics, like on the Marvel side, they're trying to push comics to demographics of new readers. Unfortunately, most of those new readers don't know about these comic books because most comic books are sold in comic book stores. And most comic shops, they sell individual issues. And if people cannot find those individual issues at a comic shop, what happens is they don't know about them, and then those books don't get sold. And in most areas of this country, there aren't that many comic shops. I remember back here in New York, there used to be all sorts of comic book stores all over the place. I mean, we had 2 or 3 in the Bronx. We had multiple comic stores in Manhattan, and there were some even out in Brooklyn. But these days, in some parts of the country, there is only one comic shop for over 100 miles. And Diversity in Comics has talked about this, and many others have talked about it, like Captain Cummings, Douglas Ernst, Just Some Guy. Many others, they've talked about this. And I know this for a fact because I've studied the industry for over 30 years, and I've wanted to be a part of the industry. And I know that we lost over 50% of the comic shops in the 97 collapse of the industry after Marvel decided to buy Heroes World, and that really screwed up the distribution system. And now we're starting to lose a lot of shops with the Marvel producing some of the worst content in the history of the medium, and DC deciding they wanted to rebuild their whole universe. And that is pushing people away. And because they're not coming back to buy comics and they're walking away and not having books on their pull lists, what's happening is that these shops are going under, and that's not really good for the long-term health of the comic book industry. If there are no comic book stores, there is no place to sell comics. And if there's no place to sell comics, then there is not going to be much of a medium left, because the only thing after that is, if you kill the comic shops, what happens is there's Barnes & Noble, and Barnes & Noble is very rickety, and Amazon is if they're the only game in town, we're in trouble, because when you become the only game in town, then you can start restricting what type of content goes on a website. And this is where we're headed for the comic book industry if they don't turn things around. And it's going to take a long time to turn things around, because in the publishing industry, everything is very slow. And this is something most people don't understand about the comic book industry and how dire the situation is. I've looked at these numbers, and again, these are the worst numbers in the history of the entire industry. I mean, I'm seeing books that in the 1980s, like the X-Men, which sold over 1 million units in 88, 89, literally down to 40,000 orders, and that means there's only 20,000 people probably buying X-Men at any given time. Spider-Man, which was a 500,000 selling book back in the 80s, Amazing Spider-Man, especially when Todd McFarlane was on it, was a 500,000 selling book. That book is now barely down to 50,000 orders. So that means there's only like 25,000 sold in any given time. I mean, you have Batman, who's at 75,000 units, and if you take that ordered, and if they take a look at the numbers, that means it may be 35,000 sold. Those numbers are horrible when you consider the history of many of these characters. And when I take a look at a character like Superman, who was at one time selling 5 million units back in the 1950s, and he's down to 40,000 units, that makes me shake my head, because, I mean, to go from 5 million in the 1950s down to 40,000 units, that's a steep decline, and it shows how dire things are in this industry. Now, some people think, oh, there's a Black Panther movie coming out, and that means people are going out to buy the trades, but trade paperbacks are secondary income for comic book publishers. The primary source of income for comic book publishers comes from 32-page comics sold at comic shops. That's how publishers make their profits. That's how they make their money on the primary income. They make their primary income by selling those 32-page books for $3.99. After that material is published and sold at $3.99, they then go into reprints, and then those trade paperbacks are reprints, and the reprints are considered gravy in the publishing industry. And we can't get to the gravy if we don't have the meat. And the meat of the comic book industry are 32-page comics, and 32-page comics are struggling to sell these days. And with the health of the industry, it's just not in a good place right now. Now, I know there's a lot of people saying, oh, there's a Black Panther movie coming out, but there may not be any more Black Panther comics or Marvel comics coming out if they continue heading down this road where they're producing these books that promote social justice warriors narratives and identity politics, because these books, they just don't sell at comic shops, and they just don't sell anywhere because many of them are written by grossly unqualified writers, many of them are drawn by grossly unqualified artists, and many of them feature stories that are completely puerile and make absolutely no sense. And a comic shop owner, there's nothing they can do to sell these books. They can't mark them down, they can't get rid of them, and because they are swamped by them, this is what leads to them going out of business. And if we keep losing comic shops at this point, there aren't going to be many places for comic fans to go out here and buy comic books. And that really would be sad because this is a great medium and it's a great storytelling medium. And I would hate to see it die because people at the top at Marvel and people at the top at DC just don't want to get their stuff together. There's a chance to save this industry, and there's a chance to try to revive interest in comic books because there are people out there, there are kids out there who want to read comics and they want to learn more about the characters they saw in many of these superhero movies. And there are people who are waiting on the sidelines for years. There are comic fans I have talked to online who've been waiting for years for new comics. And there are lots of black comic fans who have been waiting years for new comics. And they've been waiting for the industry to get its stuff together, but they're not seeing any incentive to go out here and buy new comics because most of the publishers just don't have people working there with the vision, with the plan, or to set a direction for the industry that will lead to people building the word of mouth that gets comics not only sold at local comic shops, but sold in trade paperbacks in places like Amazon.com for the long term. When it comes down to Black Panther, yes, he's having a short-term boost due to the hype related to the movie as related to black comic fans, but that's only short-term. Long-term, this comic book industry is in some dire straits and is in some serious trouble. And when you have books that are just barely selling 20,000 units and are getting 40,000 orders, we are in a seriously desperate situation. A situation where if the people who work at these comic book publishers like Marvel and DC don't get stuff right, we won't have a comic book industry in a couple of years, and we may not have many of these characters around for the foreseeable future. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, The Temptation of John Haynes, and the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.